22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. While most of Europe slept, 3.8 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, the largest military invasion in the history of human civilization. Hitler's generals predicted the entire Soviet border region would collapse within 48 hours. They were right, almost everywhere. But there was one place, a single fortress on the border, where something extraordinary happened. Where a few thousand exhausted, starving, and outnumbered soldiers defied one of the most powerful armies on earth. For 30 days. To understand why Brest Fortress matters, you have to understand the world in 1941. By the summer of that year, Adolf Hitler had already conquered Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and Greece. His armies had never lost a major campaign. His generals were legends. His strategy, blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was reshaping the entire concept of modern warfare. The Soviet Union, despite a non-aggression pact signed with Nazi Germany in 1939, was next on Hitler's list. The operation was codenamed Barbarossa, named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Its goal was simple: destroy the Soviet military within weeks, capture Moscow before winter, and end the war by autumn. Standing in the way of this plan, at the very wet 15 a.m. on June 22, that quiet ended forever. At exactly 3:15 a.m., over 9,000 German artillery shells rained down on the fortress in a single hour. The barrage was so intense that survivors later described it as feeling like the ground itself was being ripped apart. Buildings collapsed, barracks were destroyed, water pipes burst, the ammunition depot, critical for any defense, was hit. On the night of June 21, approximately 9,000 Soviet soldiers were garrisoned inside the fortress. Among them were men from over a dozen Soviet republics: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians. There were also families, the wives and children of officers who lived in quarters inside the fortress walls. Nobody expected the attack that was coming. By all accounts, that Saturday evening was quiet. Some soldiers were at a theater performance. Others were writing letters home. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, that quiet ended forever. At exactly 3:15 a.m., over 9,000 German artillery shells rained down on the fortress in a single hour. The barrage was so intense that survivors later described it as feeling like the ground itself was being ripped apart. Buildings collapsed, barracks were destroyed, water pipes burst, the ammunition depot, critical for any defense, a battle-hardened unit that had previously participated in the fall of France and Poland. Their commanding officers expected to capture the fortress within 8 hours. 8 hours. What happened instead would shock the entire Wehrmacht. While German tank columns raced hundreds of miles deep into Soviet territory, capturing entire armies, encircling cities, advancing faster than any army had moved in modern history, the fortress at Brest held. In those first chaotic hours, Soviet soldiers, many of them half-dressed, many without weapons, many separated from their units, did something remarkable. They didn't run, they fought back. By mid-morning on June 22, the Germans had expected to be celebrating inside the fortress. Instead, they were pinned down, taking heavy casualties, unable to advance through the ancient brick corridors and fortified walls. The commander of the 45th Division sent a message to headquarters that would have seemed unthinkable 24 hours earlier: the fortress is resisting with unprecedented stubbornness. By day 2 of the siege, it was clear that no relief was coming. The rest of the Soviet military was in full retreat, or worse, already captured. The garrison at Brest was completely cut off. No food resupply, no ammunition resupply, no communications with the outside world. And crucially, no water. The Germans had destroyed the water mains in the first bombardment. This was deliberate. They knew that thirst would do what bullets couldn't: break the defenders' will. Inside the fortress, men began digging into the floors of cellars, trying to reach underground water. At night, the bravest among them would crawl through German lines under fire, sometimes dragging wounded comrades, to reach the river just outside the walls and return with water in helmets, cups, even their own boots. Many never made it back. Among the defenders was Major Pyotr Gavrilov, a career officer who became the leader of one of the fortress's main defensive sectors. Under his command, a few hundred soldiers held the eastern fort against repeated German assaults. Gavrilov was not a saint. He was a product of his time. But in those weeks of hell, he displayed something beyond ideology. He displayed pure human defiance. The Germans tried everything. They dropped leaflets urging surrender, promising food, water, and safe treatment. Most were ignored. They brought in heavier artillery. They used flamethrowers to clear rooms. On June 29, day 8 of the siege, the Germans unleashed their heaviest bombardment yet. A single bomb weighing 1,800 kilograms, nearly 2 tons, was dropped on the central fortress. The explosion was visible from the city of Brest, kilometers away. And still the fortress did not fall. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of what happened inside Brest Fortress are the inscriptions left on its walls. When Soviet historians investigated the fortress after the war, they found messages carved into the brick and stone by defenders who knew they might never be found alive. One inscription, found in the ruins of the barracks, read, "I am dying but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." July 20th, 1941. July 20th. That is almost 1 month after the invasion began. A month after the Germans thought they'd be done with this place. Another inscription found near the Koln Gate reads simply, "We were 3. We held out for a long time. We will hold out until the end." No names, no regiment numbers. Just 3 men, somewhere in the rubble, refusing to quit. These weren't soldiers following orders anymore. There were no more orders. These were human beings making a choice, the last choice available to them, about how they would face the end. By mid-July, organized resistance had mostly collapsed. The fortress was in ruins. Hundreds were dead. Most survivors had been captured. But isolated pockets kept fighting. Major Gavrilov, by now severely wounded, having lost most of his men, continued fighting from the casemates with a small group. They had no food, almost no ammunition. They were surviving on rainwater and whatever they could find in the ruins. On July 23, 1941, 32 days after the invasion began, Gavrilov was finally captured. German soldiers who found him described a man so weakened he could barely stand. Yet even in captivity, when offered food and water, he initially refused, not wanting to accept anything from his captors. German soldiers present later reported that several of them, had fought across Europe, were visibly shaken by this half-dead Soviet officer who refused to accept that he had lost. The German after-action report listed total casualties at approximately 500 killed and over 1,000 wounded. For a fortress they expected to take in 8 hours. Against defenders who had no relief, no resupply, and no hope of survival. Pyotr Gavrilov survived German captivity, barely. He endured 4 years in Nazi prison camps. He was liberated in 1945 and returned to the Soviet Union, where returning POWs were often treated with suspicion. For years, Gavrilov lived in obscurity. It wasn't until 1956 that a writer named Sergei Smirnov began investigating the true story of Brest Fortress. What he uncovered shocked the Soviet public. The story had been largely buried, partly because many survivors had spent years in camps, partly because the catastrophic defeats of 1941 were an uncomfortable subject for Soviet leadership. When the story reached the public, Gavrilov was finally recognized. In 1957, he was awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could give. He was 56 years old. He had waited 16 years. Today, the Brest Fortress is one of the most visited memorial sites in Belarus. A massive monument, the face of a Soviet soldier, carved from stone, over 30 feet tall, stands at its entrance, flanked by an eternal flame that has burned continuously since 1971. Over the gates, an inscription reads, "I am dying but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." The same words a nameless soldier carved into a wall, alone in the dark, in the summer of 1941. History is full of famous last stands. Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift. We remember them because they speak to something deep in the human experience, the question of what people are capable of when everything is stripped away. The defense of Brest Fortress is not as well known in the West as it deserves to be. Part of that is the language barrier. Part of it is Cold War politics. Part of it is simply that the Eastern Front, the largest and bloodiest theater of World War II, remains poorly understood outside of Russia and Eastern Europe. But the numbers speak for themselves. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died in World War II. More than every other nation's losses combined. The war that the West calls World War II is called in Russia and Belarus the Great Patriotic War, and stories like Brest Fortress are the reason why. The men and women inside that fortress, most of them forgotten by name, known only by the inscriptions they left on crumbling walls, bought time with their lives. Every hour the Germans spent at Brest was an hour not spent racing toward Moscow. Every German soldier wounded or killed, there was one fewer soldier in the battles that would come later. History doesn't always reward the famous and the powerful. Sometimes it's kept alive by ordinary people who simply refuse to give up. This has been the story of Brest Fortress. If this video moved you, share it, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. See you in the next one.